So The Price of Salt was for many years the only lesbian novel in either hard or soft cover with a happy ending. Do you think that's part of its success?
Well, I didn't know that. I thought there were all those pulpy novels.
Yeah, but they end up dead or crazy?
Do they all?
Apparently,
Okay.
according to one of these literary researchers that said that.
I find it extraordinary that it was Highsmith who managed that. But yeah, I'm sure it does contribute to its success, its continuing success as well.
There are different versions of whether she initially envisioned a tragic ending and then her agent persuaded her. I mean, another version, she wanted a happy ending and then surprised herself with a happy ending because there hadn't been happy endings in her own life. I mean, but that was still to come. You know, looking back, the framing device that you and Todd Haynes, as I understand, worked together and added. What does it do? Is it a sort of tease? I mean, initially it implies an unhappy ending.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Or at least it throws you into the middle of something you don't have an expectation for, or if you do, it's a rather different expectation. I think this came from Todd's desire to honor, in part, a film he loves, which is Brief Encounter, which actually doesn't have a happy ending.
No.
But nonetheless, it was his desire to use it as a sort of visual touchstone, a kind of film where emotion is expressed through gesture, and so is Carol, largely. And so it came from that. And basically my marching orders were, can we find a framing device? And the scene in the bar at the Ritz Tower seemed a natural place to put that. Todd's also very fond of characters who appear who don't have any importance in the narrative, hence that guy at the top, Jack.
Jack, yeah.
Who I suppose is important in his way. Imagine being the guy who's forever known as the guy who interrupts and I love you. But, you know.
But there's also that, when you mentioned Brief Encounter, the opening of Brief Encounter where they pan I don't know if anyone remembers this, but it's a David Lean movie, and they pan the train station waiting room or cafe, and in one little corner is Trevor Howard and Celia Johnson, but you don't see them because the tension is all with the kind of Jack character, the guy coming, and he's ordering his I don't know, he's late, he's ordering his coffee, he's having a to-do with the woman, the waitress or the manager of the cafe, and that's where the movie starts. Yeah. And here it starts with Jack going to I hadn't noticed the similarity until going back and looking at that.
Yeah. So that's where that came from.
And are you comfortable with the director saying, I want this, I need that? I mean, this as a writer?
Well, I guess because I also direct, I know that happens. Not all the time, but a fair amount of the time, and it's a thing that directors must do. Sometimes psychologically, in order to make something feel to have more of his or her own, right? What some do, and Todd didn't do, is just take the thing and destroy it.
Yes.
Or rewrite it. And it's to everybody's credit that didn't happen. He got a draft very late in the game, so it was basically what it is now, apart from a framing device and the changes that would necessitate.
Do you want to talk a bit about the game, because it did go on for such a protracted period of time? When you first started, you were invited to write the screenplay, and
yes, I was, by a woman who had the rights to the novel. Who was a producer who I think saw herself in this story, which is not a bad motivation to want to make a movie. But she had a similar kind of experience to Carol, not in 1952, but rather more recently in the 90s, and she discovered that she was gay. And since she was, I'd say, I think it's fair to say, a fairly inexperienced producer, there was none of the usual rules at work in terms of, having a producer say to you, kid, this is what you do when you write a screenplay. Do
they say that still?
They can. They don't say it to me anymore, but because I would laugh in their faces. But it is a thing. Okay. And at that time, this was the first thing I had been hired to write. I had worked in the theater, and so I had a certain freedom, other than having certain things be important to this producer. Please if you can, hit this hard and hit that hard. And early on, I thought that was my job. And then I thought, no, actually, this is wrong. Let's do right by Pat's novel. And so I did. I rewrote it, eventually. It had, there was a director attached to it very early on, and this was in the late 90s. And then that director left to make some television thing, and hence this very long saga began, really.
I've read so many names attached as possible directors. I don't know, from I think Kenneth Branagh to Stephen Frears to...
Yeah, no, I
don't know whether
it's very amusing to me. There were actually, I'll tell you, the people who were officially attached to Carol.
John Crowley, I think, was one.
Yes. He was attached before Todd. He brought Kate onto the project, or not, depending on whose version of the story you're going to listen to. But it was John and Kate were attached at the same time. Then the first thing John did apparently was take another job. And he went off and he made that movie and waited and waited and waited. And eventually the producer made a difficult decision. But it worked out because John went off and made Brooklyn, right? So it worked out for all. Before John Crowley, who was attached?
Hetty MacDonald?
That was the very first.
John Maybury?
John Maybury and Hetty MacDonald. Yeah, those two. I loved John, and I loved John's movie, Love is the Devil, but I don't know what this would have been like, Carol, with that. And then Ken Branagh was actually attached. And that's it, as far as attachments.
And that just other commitments come up? Things just come and go, or...
Various
Each one has its own story.
Each one has its own story, and it's very long stories attached. I felt like I was in a Russian novel at a certain point. And that was it. I mean, I've heard all sorts of bizarre names as official attachments that I thought, wow, really? I didn't know that.
So you're the only through line, because even the producers changed.
Yes.
As well as the directors.
That's right. So.
And you first met Patricia Highsmith in New York. You were a researcher at the New York Times. She was assigned to write a piece about a walking tour of the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Right. You were assigned to accompany her. What happened? How did you become friends?
Well, on that day that I was, the editor sent me with some trepidation. I had no idea why, but I found out. She was fierce, Pat Highsmith, and on the ride out to the cemetery, she didn't talk to me at all. She was smashed up against a car window. And I thought, oops. I mean, that's okay. I'm just the slave for the day. But she looked at me at one point. She said, what do you think of Eugene O'Neill? So sort of out of the blue, they tell me you want to be a dramatist. I said, well, yeah, maybe. Well, so what do you think of Eugene O'Neill? I thought, well, I have two choices, lie or tell the truth, lie or tell the truth. So I told the truth. I said, not much. She said, good. A few minutes later, she did the same thing with, and what do you think of Tennessee Williams? I said, him I have a lot of time for. Good. Finally, as we're pulling up to the cemetery, she said, what about this Sam Shepard guy? This is like 1987, 6, 7. I said, oh, yeah, he's very interesting. Yes. I saw a play last night, Fool for Love. Interesting play. That's it. For 90 minutes, we poked around the graves and stuck our hands in the crematorium. It was just awful. She didn't say another word to me. And at the end of it, she pulled out her flask of whiskey. Well, I didn't know what it was. And she said, it was about 11 a.m. by this time. She said, I don't know about you, but I need a drink. She took a swig and then she held it out to me. Like, you have to have a drink. And it was scotch, which is her favorite drink. And that's how we became friends.
Really?
Yeah. I was going to London the following week on just a holiday, like a kid's holiday. And she was going to meet, I didn't know this at the time, but it was her illicit married woman lover. And she asked me to go to lunch at this house fraught with tension, which included a visit from Joe Losey's wife, Patricia Highsmith, who was carrying her husband's ashes on her lap the whole time.
I see a theme through this. You know.
So how could we not be friends? That's how it happened.
But she had a reputation as being a very tough, dark person, but that wasn't your experience.
It was not my experience with her at all. The only time, she was actually a very generous person, at least to me. She didn't like stupid people, I can say that, right? I mean, you know, who does? But Pat particularly had no tolerance for them and let people know when she thought they were foolish. She was also had some problems. I mean, she was a terrible racist and anti-Semite. And her saving grace in that regard is you could call her on it. You could yell at her. You could say, I don't agree. And she would do her, you know, you're young, you'll learn. I'd say, I feel like I'm talking to my grandfather, you know. That was that kind of bizarre immigrant attitude, but she wasn't some, you know, Sicilian immigrant. She was born and bred in the States and should have known better and went to Barnard, but that was her. If you did not ever have to engage her on those issues, she could be quite charming, entertaining, had a lot of interesting things to say about writing, but she also was a mean drunk and talked about, you know, her hatred of Jews. So it was like, I don't understand this. But that's a whole other topic for another day.
And what did you know of her work at the time that you met her?
I knew all the Ripley books. and one of my favorite of her books is Deep Water, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous book. And Edith's Diary. So Deep Water and Edith's Diary and the Ripley books. What one hadn't yet to be written or was being written, the last Ripley book.
But you hadn't read Price of Salt or Carol? Carol
nope.
Would have just been coming out as Carol in 1990. You met her in 87. But you hadn't read Price of Salt, and
no,
then you
I hadn't.
Didn't read Carol when it came out?
I hadn't. And I asked her which of her books, you know, she thought I should read. And she mentioned quite a few others, but not that.
And when Carol was reissued as Carol with that afterword in 1990, you didn't read it then either?
Well, she gave me a copy, a Bloomsbury hardback copy. She inscribed it and said, well, by that time I was making some headway in the theater. And she said, I don't expect this is one of them you'll ever have anything to do with.
So you weren't curious to read it?
She didn't like it. And I thought, if I read it and don't like it, what will I say? She already thinks I'm some too liberal, you know. You know, I didn't want to have that argument with her about how possibly it was a good book.
Isn't that funny? Yeah.
But she never had much regard for it, and I think it's not because she thought it was bad. I don't think she thought much of what she wrote was bad. it was because it was personal. And it was difficult for her to own the sort of odd tenderness in it. Mm-hmm. So when she spoke of it, it would be, about its psychopathy, which she felt there was a fair amount of. And
which is that connection between love and murder, or the criminal and the amorous mind?
In the novel, Therese is basically a stalker, isn't she? I mean, she really is. If you read that kind of character beats line by line, Therese is not very nice, and she's very angry when Carol doesn't go along with her. And I know that Pat stalked the woman, Virginia Sen. Mm-hmm. And would go to her house. I mean, not that she ever revealed herself to her, but that's pretty much what Pat saw in Therese, that character. I want. Which then, of course, interestingly later became Ripley, who is not allowed to express his homosexuality for sure, which I've always felt leads him to murder. But yeah, I mean, this wasn't one of her favorite books.
So it wasn't until after she died, in fact, 2 years after she died, that you were approached to write the screenplay, at which point you read the book.
I did.
And what did you think?
And I thought, this is good. She should have, should have owned this, really, more than she had. And I wanted to do it because I felt it was coming to me for a reason. I knew her. She died quite recently. She had died. And I was struck by the book's refusal to indulge in a sort of cheap psychology about the genesis of gayness, which is unique to Carol in the literature, I think. No one whines about being gay. No one questions it. There is a lot of questioning going on around it. And also her views on motherhood I found quite radical for the day, and what constitutes being a responsible parent, and how do you know. And so I wanted to do the adaptation for those reasons, but if I had known it was going to take so long, probably would have chosen something else.
But I understand you drew on your knowledge of Patricia Highsmith to flesh out Therese, who's clearly autobiographical. In anything in particular that you...
Well, I think it's more about, a certain watchfulness that Pat had, a stillness about her. And I heard her voice as I was writing. There's an inflection of her in it. And the really spooky thing is that Rooney Mara really does sound like what I think the young Pat must have sounded like. She does sound like her in this movie. I mean, later on, when you can get available voice recordings of Pat's voice, you can hear that. You can hear that in it. It's years of whiskey and unfiltered cigarettes. But nonetheless, it's there.
And she made her character. She made Therese a little bit younger than she was. I mean, she was 28 when that woman walked into the store. She makes her 19.
19, a little younger, yeah.
But Rooney Mara is actually 30, but that's,
I always imagined Pat felt really embarrassed to be working at Bloomingdale's when she was 28, and that's why she made that character quite that young.
What about Carol? How did you figure her out?
Oh, well, that was a joy and a gift, because she doesn't exist. She's a brilliant shadow in the book, which really works because as a reader, you can project your own image, even a visual image of Carol.
Well, but she is that blonde.
She's blonde. Well,
assured.
She's blonde, and she's got a fur coat, and But if you didn't know it was Virginia Sen, and you didn't know about Pat, what I always imagined when I wrote Carol was a very specific thing, which is Grace Kelly in Rear Window. Not just Grace Kelly, but Grace Kelly in Rear Window. And even the sound of it, and what she might have said, and how she might have said it. And watching just a little bit of it tonight, I thought, I could, Kate who didn't know that, it's there somewhere.
Why did you change Theresa's professional aspirations? In the novel, she's a set designer, and here she's a photographer. I mean, we spoke earlier about the photography as a visual design for in terms of Todd Haynes. But why did he ask you to change it, or was your idea?
No, this predated.
Yeah. Even though you worked in theater.
Well, that's why, because I know how boring it is to. Nobody gets theater right on film, I'm sorry. Not even All About Eve, which is one of my very favorite films, gets theater right. And it's because, well, why should they? They're all filmmakers and haven't worked a great deal in theater. But I thought also there's nothing more interior than a character sitting at the back of a theater making a sketch of a house or something.
There's some water
yeah.
right there.
And it's static, and it's not very helpful as a cinematic. If you want to express character through action, eek, and what kind of bad play will she be watching being rehearsed? I mean, there's just the whole thing was a nightmare to me. And photography seemed, again, it's always the simplest answer. That's easy, it's visual. I came up with the idea of a person who is not interested in people, who then through her photography, again, without a lot of exposition, she becomes interested, even if it's just in one particular person. She's graduated from rocks to a body.
And has that line where she says, I'm being encouraged to move from things to people. You have Richard, I mean, and through the photography, there are other aspects that I mean, Richard buys her a cheap camera, Carol buys her a fancy camera. In the novel, she buys Carol an expensive present, a handbag, but here she just buys her a 78. I mean, is there any significance? Did you work out something with that?
It just seemed like more trouble than it was worth to have. On film, you see someone who doesn't have a lot of money going out and blowing her whole paycheck on, I forget what it was she bought her, a handbag. And it raises more questions than it's worth answering. Does she have a problem? Does she, especially with contemporary culture's obsession with making everything relate to the present day. It's like suddenly I thought, Therese she would have a spending addiction or God knows what. Again, she didn't have money. She saved. She's spending the money, the trip she was supposed to take with Richard, on her trip with Carol and paying her rent. And like she's a girl who could afford a 78. And it's this particular one, isn't it? So the song she plays for her.
You also set the story slightly later than in the novel, into 1953. Why was that?
Well, two reasons. One was entirely selfish. The fashion was better, more flattering. I mean, these are very practical, weird things that I think a lot of people who write or direct or produce films think about. Who are you going to get to wear the 1948 fashions that weren't flattering? And someone mentioned that to me early on, but I had already decided to set it just as Eisenhower was being inaugurated. This was supposed to be a much more open time. The war was past. Anything was possible in this new America. And it turned out to be the most repressive 4 or 5 years, well, until now maybe, but it seemed completely right. It was also less free. The social mores were less free in 1952 than they were right after the war, when people were still like happy the war was over. So you could imagine them being a little looser and a little freer. Not so in 1952, at the end of 1952. And
you bring all these political things almost into our peripheral vision. In the New York Times office at the end, in the photos, they're looking at black men being rounded up against a wall. There's stuff on the radio that is about the House Un-American activities. That was another thing you just wanted to...
Well, that's interesting because all of that stuff is the pictures they're looking at, or those are all decided after discussions with production director, and basically all I said about it was it shouldn't be sports, or it shouldn't be. You should try to connect it to somehow, So if Judy Becker or anyone asked, or Todd, that's what I'd say. And a lot of that stuff, bizarrely, is made up anyway, right on the spot by the Loop group. So they're given a subject when they're looping the film, talk about Mickey Mantle or baseball or politics, and they do.
You also shift perspective. The novel is really from the point of view of Therese. I mean, we're talking the degree to which Patricia Highsmith's alter ego, but you change that. You move it to Carol, especially towards the end, so that we're always linked to, in a sense, the more desperate person or something. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean that just seems a natural progression. You're always with the one who loves more, or you think loves more in any particular moment. But unless we were making, a shadow puppet movie that would play in 3 cinemas somewhere, we couldn't do that subjective, this is all Therese. It was never, ever envisioned that way, not from its earliest days. It was always, let's try to get this out, this story out to as many people as we can. And so, that being said, Carol had to be invented, and there had to be some change. I hate that word. It's not, I don't mean it in the way that people who talk about screenwriting usually mean it, like the character has to change. I don't believe that. I don't believe anyone changes ever. But if you are a horrible person, you are always a horrible person. Your circumstances...
No growth?
Yeah, growth. As my grandmama would say, growth my ass. Yeah. But your circumstances change, and you shift in relationship to your circumstances, and I think that's
and your desire maybe too.
That's right. Yeah. I think when you're very young, and your taste isn't formed yet, it can appear that you change, But I think that what happens is you just mature and your taste is formed. So Therese probably in 10 years might be what might appear to be a different sort of person, but it's probably the same sort of slightly detached, quiet introvert that she is here.
Just before we go to questions for the audience, what do you look for in a book to adapt? Because you're working on some other projects now, and you've worked on this.
Yeah. What do I look for? I look for... Nowadays, I look for a compelling female center who isn't a teenager, and who is the clear center of her universe in relationship to whoever's around her, be it a man or a woman, and for an authorial voice that relies on humor. It doesn't have to be a comedy. In fact, it's probably best it's not, but who has a dark vision of just something I haven't encountered before. I like thrillers, and I like genre stuff. What I don't like are stories of personal triumph over
adversity,
or based on a true fact story. It would have to be a crime story, something that I could make into a metaphor for something else, and that's hard to do with inspirational tales of, survival in the woods, or, not my thing.
You want to briefly talk about what you've been working on now?
Yeah, I've just finished up an adaptation of a German novel by a young woman called The Trap, which is a thriller, a psychological thriller about a woman who hasn't left her house in 12 years. She probably, I mean, really, she's 38. The movie, she'll probably be 21, right? But, you know, she hasn't left her house because the last time she left her house, she saw her sister being murdered. 12 years later, she's watching TV and sees, say, Anderson Cooper on TV, and she says, oh my God, that guy killed my sister. Right. Of course, no one believes her. So, and he may not have. What I like about this book is that she may be nuts. She may be nuts. And she sets about this elaborate trap that's part Death and the Maiden, part The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, to catch who this person she thinks is her sister's killer. And she has to do it by herself. So that's a studio movie. I mean, it's not like I went out and bought the rights to this thriller. And I've done an adaptation of a very strange Italian novel called the Luneberg Variation, which is, how to describe this? There's no women in it, and I broke my own, rule because it's so compelling. A piece of work. It's a Holocaust revenge thriller set in the world of international chess. Yeah, it's really quite startling.
So
those are two
what you
things
responded to in that was its unusualness, or its willingness to grapple with a more mystical approach to, the guy who is seeking revenge on his old adversary in the chess games. Grew up to be his commandant in the concentration camp, and what happens in that camp, which isn't the center of the novel. Mm-hmm. But which spurs on this extraordinary narrative of revenge that goes on until the 80s, is what interested me. And the way that we pass along not only our desires for revenge, but how we take responsibility in doing so. I haven't seen anything like this. It's like, for me, I don't know if this will make sense to anybody, but for me it's the antidote to Munich. The movie Munich.
Yes. Yeah.
Steven Spielberg.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to open. Please wait for the microphone to come to you before you ask your question. There's one right there.
Thank you. It was a total treat. Thanks so much. And at the beginning, you said to watch for the shots through glass. And that was just a delight. And I wondered if you could expand on your thoughts around that.
Yeah, well, it was obviously a motif that Todd and Ed Luckman, the DP, came up with as a way to dramatize and make poetic various aspects of their relationship. There's always something, one is always on one side, the other is on the other side until quite late in the movie, whether it's a taxi cab window or a real mirror or a glass wall or what have you. The restaurant door, that shot is a favorite. And the diner towards the end when she's reading Abby's letter is that's a beautiful shot. And that so perfectly illustrates the emotional distance right at that moment between them. And as an homage to Saul Leiter, all those shots are pretty startling. The primary colors, all of that kind of thing that he used in his New York photos are all there.
And the color scheme of their clothes.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't know. You tell me, you guys. Yeah.
Is that a question over there?
That was my question, actually.
Oh.
What did you want us to learn about the changing colors in the costumes?
Well, there's a lot of... there's some red, right? Early on, Carol. And there's a lot of blue with Therese early on. And Abby is always green, which I actually questioned as a color choice because of the whole green with envy thing. I thought it was maybe a little too. But actually, and having spoken to the designers and taught a bit, it was also about color coordinating with her hair. She's a redhead in the film, isn't she? She's a bit of a redhead, Sarah Paulson. But again, the New York primary colors, there's yellow, red, green, yellow, the stoplights, which is a constant motif in both the clothes and in the street photography. I just thought it was very interesting how that all works. And then it goes away. As the film moves on, Carol starts to wear a lot of neutral colors, a lot of gray, a lot of
earth tones, even
earth tones, beiges, and so does Therese. That outfit she has on at the end is sort of
gray. Therese's is gray and Carol's is beigeier or something.
Yeah, Therese has that sort of printy thing, but it's a beige and blackish, but they start to wear the same odd colors, don't they?
And incidentally, I mean, since you've seen the movie, there's no spoiler, but it was shot in Cincinnati. It's to recreate the idea of New York in the 50s. Originally, I think Crowley was going to shoot it in Montreal, as he shot Brooklyn in Montreal. Yeah. But then Todd Haynes didn't want to do that because he had shot I'm Not There in Montreal, and so he'd sort of done that to try to recreate some of New York in Montreal. So.
Yeah, I actually don't think it works, Montreal, for New York. I don't think
you don't
it
think
works.
it yeah.
No.
And is there anything you noticed particularly here?
The street lights are different, but I grew up in New York, so I would know that somehow. And the streets are wider in Cincinnati, but a lot of that architecture is actually the same. There are a number of shots when they're driving, Abby and Carol in particular, over the bridge, where literally half the skyline is CGI'd out because it's all glass and steel, and they had to recreate, buildings that would have been there, just like the first shot of the film where Jack's crossing the street, and you look down Broadway. I guess it's supposed to be Broadway, and they have actually built a replica of Times Square down there. Again, nobody notices this on first viewing. The other thing that's has always bothered me, is that opening subway shot. It's completely wrong. There is no subway station in 1952 New York that looked like that. None. And not even now. But
anybody notice the subway?
No one. Yeah.
Okay, other question over there?
You commented that Therese was the stalker, and I have difficulty appreciating that. Could you just enlarge upon that?
Have you read the novel? I was referring to the novel. And yes, in the novel, her behavior is rather stalker-esque. So if you haven't read the novel, I can't really elaborate on that.
But you didn't want to make her a stalker. I mean,
No, she's not.
He's not a stalker in the movie.
No,
yeah.
No, not at all.
But I think everyone is slightly more sympathetic. Harge is more sympathetic in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, the men in the novel are rather brutish. I think that's fair to say. And then maybe I wondered as I was reading it, because Pat didn't write great dialogue. And so a lot of what the men do in the book, it's expressed in this really blunt, you're a dyke, or whatever it is they say. And maybe he didn't use that word, but it's basically as blunt as that.
In fact, Richard, the boyfriend, says, "You disgust me." And,
you disgust me.
Very unpleasant.
Yeah. But I thought there was a better way to express that, not to make them, neither one of them is particularly nice. And not even Danny is, look, these guys, these are people who think it's their right to walk up to someone and just plant a kiss on her, as Danny does. Does that make him a bad guy? No. This is the way they behaved. And so my rule became, let them behave the way my older relatives behaved, as I remember in the early 60s, or the late 60s actually. Let them behave as men behaved then. It was not inconceivable that Therese would have liked Danny to kiss her, or would have liked Richard to make every decision for her. And Harj can come and go. It's his house, even though they're on the outs. So it was never my intention to make them cartoon villains, because we don't need that. Their love is such a driving force in the film, that just the men being human support the purity of that love, if that makes it makes any sense. But nor are they particularly nice. I don't think there's ever a moment where I go, oh, poor, should have stayed with him. At least I hope not.
Well, I think you can feel Harj's pain. I think that's what, and that's partly the actor. The actor, I think, is very good as well.
Yeah,
so.
He's real good in it.
Yeah. Another question over here.
What are the challenges of translating a medium like literature that's very dark and introspective to a sort of lush and visual medium like film?
Well, I think the challenge is any good novel, I think, has those qualities. I can't think of a really fine piece of fiction that's not largely interior and dark. I mean, there are lush, certainly, novels that are so lush that your breath is taken away by the language, like Lolita or something like that. But that's dark. The challenge is to honor the tone of the author. For me, other people would say it's to faithfully recreate, I don't know, the narrative that the readers fell in love with. I think for me, that's the least important thing. Plot is always the least important thing. Tone, intention. I mean, did Patricia Highsmith intend to write a novel that in some way highlights the fact that this is different than other novels of its ilk? And the answer is yes. You read this over and over again. Does she have a sense of humor? Yes, she does in this novel. And she has it in all of her novels. And it's the thing that I find lacking in most Highsmith adaptations. She has a very dark, almost juvenile in places, sense of humor that is rarely honored because they're murder stories. But so is Hitchcock's, work about murder. And I laugh a lot during Hitchcock. So did he. So it's tone and intention, really. If you can hit that, you're fine.
Up there?
Hello. Tonight we heard about the different directors involved when you were adapting The Price of Salt into Carol. Was the process different when you were adapting Very Much a Lady into Mrs. Harris, which you went on to direct yourself?
Yeah. That was different. I mean, I didn't adapt that book. It's not an adaptation. It really is, when you do something like that, you've got to buy a piece of material, or at least the studios or whoever's behind it makes you do that, so that you're covered in case anyone's alive who wants to sue. Or we live in such a litigious country, I do, that makes a bit of sense. But really that came from, I read every page of the court transcripts of Jean Harris's trial, 10,000 some odd pages of them. And everything she says in that movie, in court, comes directly from those transcripts, because you can't make it up. I mean, there's nothing as good as what she said. But that, because it was going to be my movie, that was a different process. That involved me, myself, and I sitting in a room, coming up with the scripts, going to the producer, and getting a lot more respect for what I had to say, because it was also my visual, it was my film. So that is something that screenwriters have to put up with, and it's really a difficult thing sometimes. Not with Carol, because, you know, Todd's a real director, but you can imagine sometimes when you're sitting in a room with someone who you think is just shouldn't be sitting there. And the default position becomes, that's great, interesting.
Question over there.
You mentioned Highsmith as not being a great writer of dialogue, and when watching the film, with the exception of, you know, a line like Therese being flung out of space, I don't notice direct quotation from the novel until that final interaction between Therese and Carol, where very, very much the speech is the speech from the novel. I wonder if you could talk about why you chose to use her exact words in that final conversation.
Which conversation?
Where
Harge and I are selling the house. I've moved. I found my own apartment. You wanted. There's room for two. I mean, there's that speech there.
Yeah. It's even changed. It's not exact. The placements aren't exact.
But I mean, was that significant in the way she wrote that for you? That it is not exact, but it is kind of.
Well, what's significant about that is that it was not trying to do anything. You know, even flung out of space, which I actually really don't even like as a line, but had to include. That's more her.
Why did you have to include?
Because it's such a. I was, you know, convinced that it was such an iconic line from the fan base. The fan base, I said. Really? She has a fan base? This is like. Really? So I think, yeah, you're such a in conjunction with you're a strange girl.
But she also calls her an angel. I mean, that
My
one could
angel.
see as a natural kind of term of endearment. I mean,
right.
Just call someone, you know.
But flung out of space is it's very Highsmithian. But towards the end, when there's nothing left to lose, Carol starts to calm down a bit, you know, and talk like a normal person. So it's for that reason, you know, yeah, you tell her what you're doing, and you tell her what you want, and if she's going to come, she's going to come, or not, that's fine. And it was also it's a particular construction that Carol uses when she talks about the furniture house that was quite compelling.
Last question. Where's the, okay.
Hi, sorry. I apologize if this question is a bit esoteric, but I was just wondering if, I don't know, when I watched it the second time, seeing this movie again, Rooney Mara kind of reminded me of Juliette Binoche, a young Juliette Binoche, and Milan Kundera did, he wrote Unbearable Lightness of Being, and the star of that movie was Juliette Binoche, who played a photographer named Teresa, and I was just wondering if
Usually Rooney Mara gets compared to Audrey Hepburn or something like that. I haven't heard her compared to Juliette Binoche.
I was just wondering if you, when reading this in the 90s, had ever, had some fanciful thoughts of casting this yourself, since you also direct, and if you'd ever thought of Juliette Binoche, or if ever you've had a conversation with Todd Haynes about, casting.
I can honestly say no. I thought this was going to be a Gene Simmons question. She also gets compared to Gene Simmons. Until you said that about Unbearable Lightness of Being, I hadn't even it hadn't even occurred to me. But you see these connections. Well, they're in the air. They're everywhere. I did see the movie, and I like Juliette Binoche. But I'll tell you who I liked better from the 90s was Irene Jacob, who was in the Red movie.
She was in a lot of Kieslowski movies.
And so was Juliette, right? Well, at least the one. But yeah, no, that's actually impressive, but I can't claim it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you all.